Hello friends, welcome ladies and gentlemen to today's tutorial. Today we are going to look at the ovary. Now we've seen some parts of the female reproductive system. Yes, we've seen the tubular structures like the vagina. We've seen the uterus as well as the uterine tube. We've seen the vulva. Yes, any other structure that we've done already are actually accessory structures of the female reproductive system. This ovary is actually the gonad, and for that matter, the primary organ of the reproductive system. Now, so far, the internal genitalia, yes, even from the vagina, from the uterine tubes, as well as even the uterus, they are actually tubular structures. In any case, of course, the uterus is actually a hollow, structure, which had three coats or three tulics. Now, for the ovary is actually a solid organ, will have cortex, and it will also have what you call functional parenchyma. Yes, of course, the ovary, apart from the follicular growth going to take place, which I'm going to take you through. Yes, it will also be very important. Ovulation is going to actually take place in the ovary. Yes, as well as hormone production will also actually take place in actually the ovary. So we are going to actually look at all these things. Now remember that the hormones that is going to make will actually affect all the other structures of the female reproductive system. So without much ado, let's quickly go through this ovary. So as you can see, the ovary is a paired structure. We have one on the right and then we have one on the left, and it is roughly oval structure, okay, that we find. And remember that developmentally it's actually descended actually at the level of T10. Okay, so it was actually an abdominal structure which descended via what we call the gubernaculum, okay, and entered the pelvic region. So within the pelvic region, it lies in the lateral wall of the pelvis, actually in the ovarian fossa, in the lateral wall of the pelvis. Now, what we have to know is that with respect to dimensions, what is happening is that it's going to by way of length, breadth, and height, or thickness actually. The length is roughly 3 centimeters or about 4 centimeters long. Then it's going to have a width of about 2 centimeters, and of course thickness of roughly 1 centimeters. Now, one important thing that we have to actually understand, which I'll be showing you pretty soon, will actually for us to appreciate that this is a solid organ. So it's a solid organ, okay. If we take a transverse section through it, which we are going to see, we are going to find what we call the outer portion. Okay, we're going to have what we call the functional parenchyma being divided into what we call the cortical portion, outer cortical portion, and of course the inner medullary portion. So we'll look at that one. Now, with respect to attachment, or by way of support to what we call the ovary, there's one important support which is coming from this ligament, which is known as the suspensory ligament of the ovary, or the infundibulopelvic ligament. Okay, so laterally, okay, we'll give it that support. But within this infundibulopelvic ligament, or the suspensory ligament of the ovary, we are actually going to have what we call the ovarian vessels. They are the gonadal vessels in female. That's the ovarian artery as well as the ovarian vein, which I will come to pretty soon. Now, what we are going to see is that medially it will be connected to the uterus at its conus. So on either side, because we are going to have two ovaries. So on either side, we will have what we call the ovarian ligament. Okay, as you see here. All right. Now, some books say that yes, this is actually remnant or coming from what we call the gubernaculum, the ovarian ligament, actually coming from the gubernaculum. It giving that kind of support, connecting the ovary medially to the lateral aspect around the corner of the body of the uterus. Now remember that we will get to see that each, females will go through what we call the menstrual cycle monthly. Now every month a particular ovary will be active, so that one of them will release its mature, will release a secondary oocyte from the mature follicle, the Graafian follicle, which you are going to see. So they do it alternatively. But in situations where both of them, release their, secondary oocyte, that's the ovum, at the same time, then if two different sperms fertilize them, then what will happen is that we are going to have what we call the fraternal twins. So that is what we are going to see. By way of additional support, we are also going to have, parts of, the broad ligament being the mesovarium. Mesovarium also providing that kind of, support to what we call the ovary. But what we see is that, yes, by way of blood supply to, the ovary, yes, we already seen it running through, the infundibulopelvic ligament is the ovarian artery. Now this ovarian artery, yes, we are going to have two ovaries, yes, on either side. Okay, so there will be ovarian artery, for the right, and that of the left. But what happens is that, yes, both of them are actually coming from the abdominal aorta, branch of the abdominal aorta, and therefore they are symmetrical, so to speak, almost at the same level, usually around the L1 vertebral level, and then of course, supplying, the ovaries. But these ovaries will be drained by the corresponding vein, of course, will be the ovarian vein. Okay, ovarian vein, that's the gonadal vein in females. Now what happens is that this gonadal vein, or for the right gonadal vein, that one will drain directly into what we call the inferior vena cava. But for that of the left, it will drain into what we call the left renal vein, and then before it is drained into the inferior vena cava, usually at the level of L1 level. So that is what we find regarding the venous drainage. It tells you that the left and right gonadal veins, or by way of ovarian veins, yes, are asymmetrical actually. So that is with the vasculature, blood supply to the ovaries. But with respect to nerve supply, yes, the ovary is going to have autonomous innervation. Innervation coming from the autonomic nervous system. Yes, therefore we are going to have that from the sympathetic fibers, and we're going to have that from the parasympathetic fibers. Those ones which are coming from the sympathetic fibers are actually coming from what we call the ovarian plexus. So the ovarian plexus, which is actually coming from what we call renal plexus, will actually give the ovaries sympathetic innervation. Then for parasympathetic innervation, it will be coming from what we call the pelvic plexus. So around the pelvis area, or the uterine plexus, okay, around the pelvis area, will actually give what we call parasympathetic innervation to the ovaries. So that is regarding the ovaries that we find. So as I said earlier, I told you that the ovary is actually a solid organ. Now if it's a solid organ, then it will have functional parenchyma. But even before I look at that, now look at this. Now we expect that this ovary, okay, is covered by peritoneum, and therefore it's supposed to have what we call mesothelium. Now generally mesothelium is simple squamous epithelium, but for the ovary it's actually simple cuboidal epithelium, right? So the mesothelium of actually the ovary is simple cuboidal epithelium. Now it is given this name. We also call it the germinal epithelium, but that's actually a misnomer. We know germ cells will actually come into the ovary. Yes, we know that that's going to happen, but of course this epithelium, where is simple cuboidal epithelium, is not going to give rise to the functional gametes of the ovary. by way of the secondary oocyte, and therefore this is actually a misnomer calling the surface epithelium, the mesothelium of the ovary, germinal epithelium, is actually a misnomer, because at the end of the day it's not going to give rise to what we call the the functional gametes of the ovary. Now remember that beneath this, okay, as you can see, beneath the simple cuboidal epithelium, we are going to have a layer of dense irregular connective tissue, rich in a lot of fibroblasts and of course fibrocytes, okay, a lot of fibers. Now this area, which is going to confer protection to the functional parenchyma of the ovary, is known as tunica albuginea of the ovary. So tunica albuginea of the ovary is deep to what we call the simple cuboidal epithelium that covers the surface of the ovary. Now if you get into the functional zones, there are two functional zones which we can identify regarding this solid organ. We are going to have what we call an outer cortex, an outer cortical region, and an inner larger portion which we call the medulla. Now what we find is that yes, this outer portion will have the follicles. So I will actually explain the folliculogenesis to you. Actually we'll have these follicles. Now follicles, yes, prior to puberty, they are going to be in the primordial follicle states, which I will explain pretty soon. So these are the follicles at various stages of development. This is antral follicle, this is actually the Graafian follicle, which you are going to see. We are going to find, of course, the primordial follicle, primary follicle, various types, and of course secondary follicle actually. Now what we find in the medulla, there's no sharp boundary between, of course, the cortex and the medulla. But what we find is that in the medulla is devoid of follicles. The medulla is devoid of follicles. Only that you can see all these large blood vessels in there. Okay, these are the endothelial lining of the blood vessels in there. So it's actually highly vascularized. Okay, highly vascularized. So that is with the cortical region as well as the medulla. Now one thing is that yes, usually unlike in males, yes, for males we are able to produce sperm, okay, continuously throughout our reproductive lifetime, even for nowadays, even up to the lifespan of the male. But for females will have specific defined number of gametes, which will get depleted with time. Specific number of gametes are given to them. So during the early intrauterine life, yes, what will happen is that the germ cells, okay, they are the cells which are going to actually give rise to these gametes, will actually move into the ovaries. Okay, so when they move into the ovaries, they differentiate into this diploid structure, diploid cell over here, which we call it the oogonium. Okay, so more or less the oogonium, yes, is going to be more or less like the stem cell of the functional gametes of the female. Now this oogonium will go through some mitotic divisions. Okay, but one thing that you have to remember is that this oogonium is not going to have any supporting cells. We are going to see that the primary oocyte as well as the secondary oocyte will be surrounded by what we call follicular cells, but the oogonium, which is the one who is going to undergo mitotic division, is devoid of what we call follicular cells. Okay, now that's the epithelial line which will actually cover it. Now this diploid cell will undergo mitosis, as I said, and they will give rise to these kind of oocytes that we call them primary oocytes. Now usually a lot of these primary oocytes will be produced, about 7 million of these primary oocytes will be produced around the fifth month of intrauterine life. So it is actually this area that we actually begin. So there's a primary oocyte will therefore go through the first meiotic division. Okay, so after going through first meiotic division, two cells which are both haploid. Okay, one of the cell is actually a polar body, that's the first polar body from the first meiotic division. okay, of the primary oocyte. And then so that is it. We are going to have what we call so actually the first primary oocyte will go through the first meiotic division. Now this first meiotic division will be arrested, okay, so around the 5th month of intrauterine life, it will be arrested at the diprotein or the dictyotin stage of prophase 1, okay, of of course first meiotic division. So prophase 1, it will be arrested at what we call the dictyotin or the diprotein stage. Now it can only complete, okay, this first meiotic division by giving rise to this secondary oocytes and then this first polar body around puberty. So around puberty, if it's around 13 or 12 or even 15 years, that is only when the primary oocyte will be able to complete its first meiotic division. Okay, so after completion, it will give rise to a secondary oocyte and of course a primary oocyte, and the first polar body. Yes, of course, the first polar body may actually go through some division, or you may not go through any division again. Now this secondary oocyte, yes, around puberty, will actually begin its second meiotic division. So second meiotic division will occur in the secondary oocyte. So during that division, what will happen is that it's also going to get arrested. Secondary oocyte will get arrested at what we call metaphase of second meiotic division. Now it can only complete the second meiotic division when the secondary oocytes, okay, gets fertilized by a functional sperm. Okay, that's only when the second meiotic division gets completed, so that we produce a second polar body. And of course, the fusion of the male and female sperm cell, gametes, will give us the zygote, which is totipotent. Now you realize that yes, this secondary oocyte will be found only in the Graafian follicle, and it is only the secondary oocyte which we can call it the ovum. So we can't call the primary oocyte or any of them ovum, but we can only call the secondary oocyte the ovum. So that is actually oogenesis, the production of all these gametes. Now as I said that the primary oocyte, okay, unlike the oogonium, which is not surrounded by a layer of follicular cells or epithelial cell, actually, okay, for the primordial follicle will contain the primary oocyte, and then it will be surrounded by a single layer of flat cells, squamous cells. So for you to identify that we are seeing a primordial follicle, you should have a primary oocyte sitting in the center. Then you should also have a single layer of follicular cells. So we can see these are squamous cells. Okay, so that we have it. And yes, around where we have it is going to be lie in the connective tissue, stroma of what we call the the ovary. So that is what we see over here. Now, under the influence of follicle stimulating hormone, which is actually coming from the anterior pituitary, but remember that we have hypothalamus, which is going to release this releasing hormone known as gonadotropin releasing hormone, which will actually target the anterior pituitary to actually secrete what we call follicle stimulating hormone. So it's actually going to stimulate the primordial follicle to go through what we call follicular development. So upon stimulation of this primordial follicle, this primordial follicle will eventually transform every month. For a female who is let's say around puberty, so prior to puberty or prior to your first that's what is actually going to we see the menses later on. But what I'm trying to say is that yes, prior to this kind of follicular growth, and for that matter, when you are sexually not active, or when you are reproductive, your reproductive organs are not really functional by way of the ovaries producing these kind of various follicles going through this follicular development, then what we are saying is that we are going to have only, so prior to puberty, we are going to find only primordial follicles. But around puberty, under the influence of follicle stimulating hormone, then these primordial follicle will go through this development. So I'm saying that this follicular cell, under the influence of follicle stimulating hormone, will actually become cuboidal. Okay, so this one is simple squamous, this one is simple cuboidal epithelium, okay, being the follicular cell. Now around just that time, there's also going to be what we call a non-cellular layer, which we call it zona pellucida, okay, which is more or less, a zone which is actually clear, which doesn't contain any cell, will begin forming. So zona pellucida will begin forming. But remember that separating what we call the follicular cells from the connective tissue stroma will be a basement membrane. Just like when you have any epithelial tissue, underlying the epithelial tissue will be a basement membrane separating them. That's what exactly we are going to find over here. Now this follicle, having a primary oocyte, having a single layer of cuboidal cells, is known as primary unilocular cell, or primary unilocular follicle. Sorry, unilaminar, having a single layer, primary unilaminar follicle. Now, yes, continuously with under the influence of FSH, then what will happen is that this kind of cuboidal cell, yes, will actually undergo mitosis, yes, to give rise to actually several layers of cuboidal cells. It could be 2 or 3 or even 4 or 5 layers of cuboidal cells, and that's in such a situation we will call it, yes, we still have what we call our primary oocyte in there. We will have, now you can see now that the zona pellucida, okay, has now formed better, and then we have several layers of cuboidal cell. If you have such a phenomenon, then we call you primary multilaminar follicle, primary multilaminar follicle. Now remember that originally we said that yes, we are going to have what we call simple cuboidal epithelium. Now if the epithelial line is single, we are going to call it follicular cell. Now the time that it become laminar, then we are going to now call it granulosa cell. So if you hear granulosa cell, we are still talking about the follicular cells, but this time around they are multi-layered. So we now have what we call granulosa cells. Now at the same time, this granulosa cell which has formed will actually stimulate the surrounding stromal cells, so that the nearby ones will actually be converted into what we call thicker cells. So thicker cells are actually stroma cells, the connective tissue cells, of the ovary, which are surrounding the developing follicle. So the one you find over here is the thicker interna, the one which is more closer to the granulosa cells is known as thicker interna. Then we have the one which is further away, being thicker externa. Now thicker externa, yes, is going to have some kind of spindle-like appearance. Okay, it will be fusiform in nature with some kind of smooth muscle-like features, but it doesn't have endocrine function. But for thicker interna, which is quite closer, it's roughly cuboidal in nature, and then it is going to have properties which resemble that it's actually going to make a lot of steroids, and therefore we are going to find that it's going to have a lot of smooth endoplasmic reticulum. Yes, apart from that, it's also going to have a lot of mitochondria with tubular cristae, will actually be in there. So once you are seeing such a thing with a lot of lipid droplets in there, then you know that you are capable of going through steroidogenesis. It will actually produce what we call androstenedione, which will later be converted to what we call estrogen, actually estradiol, by the granulosa cells. So what I'm trying to say is that as follicle stimulating hormone stimulates follicular growth, then what will happen is that yes, these cells will become multinucleated, now called granulosa cells, which are now capable of actually producing what we call estradiol or estrogen from androstenedione, which is produced from actually stimulation of the granulosa cells on the stromal cells, so that the stromal cells will be converted to what we call thicker cells, defined as thicker interna and of course thicker externa. I will explain that one later as we move on. Now, as follicular growth continues under the influence of FSH, then within the granulosa cells, pockets of fluid begin to sip into it. Okay, begins to sip into it. And that areas that we find, that space is known as antrum. So we call this follicle. Of course, we are having primary unilaminar, multilaminar, and this one cannot be called secondary follicle. Or because there are antral areas in there, we also call it antral follicle or vesicular follicle. Now, yes, as so that one will also have a primary oocyte. Yes, the thicker cells are there. Yes, of course, we are going to have the granulosa cells, as we've seen, being sipped in, or penetrated by what you call the pocket of fluid in several areas. And then we are also going to have immediate stroma being the thicker cells, thicker interna, and of course thicker externa. Then, in fact, as growth continues, these pockets of fluid will coalesce to form a single cavity over here, as you can see. And when we are having a single cavity, then we call it the mature follicle, or the tertiary follicle, or the pre-ovulatory follicle. So this is the one which is going to expel the oocytes. Now, at this point in time, the mature follicle is containing what we call secondary oocyte. Okay, so the Graafian follicle, or the mature follicle, is the only one which will contain the secondary oocyte. Now, one thing that we find, which I'll actually explain it in a magnified one to you. Yes, you can see that these are the granulosa cells. Okay, we are going to find, of course, the thicker interna, thicker externa. Then of course some of the granulosa cells will form a hill around over this area, so that there's that connection between, of course, the oocytes and the granulosa cells at a point of the mature follicle, and that is known as cumulus euphorus. Then we have some of them also surrounding the zona pellucida, which we call it corona radiata. So during follicular development, what we are going to see is that there will be estradiol or estrogen production. Apart from that, there will be what we call inhibin production. So that inhibin production, inhibin will actually work, in a negative feedback loop, against the production of, follicle stimulating hormone. Now, at a point in time, what will happen is that this one will get ovulated, and it is under the influence of what we call luteinizing hormone. Now, remember that there are two main hormones which are going to have influence on what we call the ovary, okay, from the anterior pituitary gland, and they are the follicle stimulating hormone, which we've seen. The second one is luteinizing hormone. But initially, follicle stimulating hormone peaks earlier, and then later, luteinizing hormone will also gradually increase, and then it will peak around day 14 of the the menstrual cycle. So all these areas represent the follicular phase, follicular stage, or actually the estrogenic phase, because estrogen is produced, estrogenic phase, or the pre-ovulatory phase. Now, at a point where this one luteinizing hormone surges, okay, there's peak of estrogen, luteinizing hormone, then what will happen is that there's going to be release of this oocyte. Okay, this oocyte will come out in a process known as ovulation, usually around day 14 if you are having a 28-day cycle. So that is that for you. For the the folliculogenesis, or follicular development of the ovary. Now, this central area will be occupied by fluid, as we said. Now, this fluid is known as liquor folliculi. That kind of fluid in the follicle. Now, as we've seen already, this is epithelial lining, the germinal epithelium, so-called germinal epithelium. This is simple cuboidal epithelium. Then we are going to have, the connective tissue stroma. Okay, we said that even beneath that we are going to have tunica albuginea beneath it, and then then we get our connective tissue stroma. okay, in both the cortical region as well as the medullary region. But we say in the cortical region we are going to have these follicles. Now you can see that actually the unlike other connective tissue that we have, for that of the ovary is highly cellular, so you can see a lot of cells in the connective tissue stroma. But we said that those ones which will immediately be around, okay, I mean the follicle, we are going to actually get transformed under the influence of the granulosa cells into what we call the theca cells, theca interna, and of course theca externa, theca interna and theca externa. So there we are. Okay, as we said that yes, if you're having a primary oocyte, okay, which arose from mitotic division of the oogonium, then we are going to get arrested. It will start its first meiotic division. It will get arrested at the diprotein stage of meiosis 1 of prophase actually. And if that is the case, so this is the oocyte, okay, which is arrested. All right, now what we find is that yes, we are going to find here, yes, this is actually the nucleus of the oocyte. Now you can see this belt structure over here, and this is known as the zona pellucida. Okay, then we said beyond that we are going to have what we call the this is actually the cytoplasm of the oocyte, the primary oocyte. We are going to have what we call the granulosa cells, okay, because this one is multi-layered. Now you can see it's cuboidal, and therefore this one is going to be the primary multilaminar follicle. Primary multilaminar follicle. Now I said that that's just the immediate surrounding of the stromal cells, connective tissue cells, are actually going to be transformed to become what we call theca cells. So those one which is just cuboidal and very proximal to what we call the granulosa cells are going to be the theca interna cells. They are actually roughly cuboidal, although we can't appreciate it here very well. They are roughly cuboidal, and then of course they will show lipid steroid synthesis properties, such that there will be a lot of smooth endoplasmic reticulum. There will be a lot of mitochondria which will be rich in a lot of tubular cristae. There will be a lot of lipid droplets in there as well. But of course the theca externa, which are spindle shaped, which you can see them here, will have that kind of smooth muscle like appearance actually. Therefore I think they will be contractile actually, but they don't have steroid producing properties, steroid producing properties. So that is what we have over here. Now this is actually a magnification of the Graafian follicle. So I told you that these are the granulosa cells. The pocket of fluid will coalesce together, so a single large cavity over here. Once you are seeing this, this fluid over here is lipofolliculi, and we said that there will be connection, okay, of the oocyte to one part of the the follicle, by way of what we call follicular cells, by way of what we call cumulus ophurus, okay, stalk, something like a stalk over here, or hill that is actually mounting this oocyte. And then even surrounding the oocyte we are also going to have what we call corona radiata. And then of course we are going to have this belt like structure, acellular structure, which we call zona pellucida. Now remember that this zona pellucida, yes, will be protective. It's actually going to protect the oocyte, and even before the so that it can also even help in communication between of course the oocyte and of course the granulosa cells or the follicular cells. And even before the sperm cell can penetrate and fertilize the oocyte, it will have to cross the barrier. There are some barriers that will have to cross. It has to cross the corona radiata. It also have to cross the zona pellucida, as well as even the membrane of what we call the secondary oocyte. So the oocyte over here can conveniently be referred to as the ovum. So that is that for you. Now, so generally, this, yes, we've seen this. There's a cross section of the ovary. Now you realize that the ovary, yes, you can have what you call the primordial follicle, which I've already explained, yes, to eventually develop into primary follicle, and then into, of course, secondary follicle, then of course into what we call the Graafian follicle, that's the pre-ovulatory follicle, which under the influence of luteinizing hormone surge will get removed from it. Now remember that every month about 15 to 20 of these primordial follicles will be selected to go through the development, but usually only one will become the mature follicle or the Graafian follicle. The rest will die on their way in a process known as atresia. Now if you remember, I told you that yes, in the female, yes, roughly after the mitotic division around the 5th month of intrauterine life, you have about 7 million oocyte, primary oocyte, but actually most of them will die, and eventually by birth you are going to have about 1 million follicles of these primordial follicles. You are going to have 1 million of these primordial follicles. Now this 1 million primordial follicles, usually at puberty, about 600,000 of them would have just died out of atresia. Okay, atresia, and therefore it will be left with only about 400,000, of which every month about 15 to 20 of them, or even it can even go to depend on it may vary from one woman to the other, maybe 25 of them will be selected, okay, to go through this follicular development that we've seen. But remember that out of the 20 or lots that we have, only one will emerge as the Graafian follicle. The rest will die on their way, and they will be referred to as atretic follicles. So atretic follicles, you can see it in the primordial follicle, you can see it in the primary, secondary, wherever, but what happens is that out of this 400,000 which will be left, really in the reproductive lifetime of a female, because females will go through actually what we call menopause, so that there's no ovulation again, there's no follicular growth again, then it tells us that yes, this kind of follicular growth, okay, is actually going to be limited. Okay, it's going to be limited. So what will happen is that roughly the number of ovulated secondary oocytes or ovum in female will roughly be around 400 to about 500 of them. So that someone may go through menopause around age 40, someone may go at 45, some may around age 50 or 52. So we may have this kind of variation. So actually from 400 to 500, okay, throughout a lady's reproductive cycle, we'll go through this. Now I told you that as follicular growth happens, estradiol is produced, or estrogen. Now remember that estrogen is needed to prepare for the initial preparation of the uterus, initial thickening of the uterus. Estrogen or estradiol will also be relevant in what we call promoting the secondary sexual characteristics of females, having broad a lot of increase in the breast size. Apart from that, of course, the gluteal region actually having a lot of adipose tissue over there, hip formation and all that, having that kind of Coca-Cola shape. All these ones are actually coming from the estradiol production by these granulosa cells, as well as the thicker internal cells. So that is why yes, females are going to have this kind of growth at puberty, because it's only at puberty that this part of growth you are going to see, because only at puberty that we are going to find this kind of follicular growth, which will eventually give rise to estrogen, which will make the female look as you are going to see the female. All right, so that is that one. Now what happens is that yes, at ovulation, it pinches out and then it goes into the peritoneum, but it will have to be captured by the fimbriae of the uterine tube, Now you realize that yes, every month this is going to happen, and therefore as you go through a lot of these kind of ovulation and a lot of attractive follicles, go through this kind of ovulations actually, then what will happen is that you're going to have a lot of scars around the uterus. So that if you take a female who hasn't ovulated before prepubertal age, then what will happen is that the person is going to have very nice ovary without any scars. But someone with about age 50 who has ovulated severally throughout her lifetime, you are going to see a lot of these scars in there. Now this process actually represents what we call ovulation. Now, after ovulation, yes, the oocyte will have to expect that it gets, fertilized in the ampulla of the uterine tube if it meets, a viable sperm. That one will happen. But the follicle, that's the oocyte. The follicle, the remaining part of the follicle, will be reorganized into what we call corpus luteum. Corpus luteum. Corpus has to do with body and luteum has to do with yellow. So this corpus luteum is a yellow body. But initially, what will happen is just after ovulation, what will happen is that there will be blood, around over here, which, of course, will have to, be later get clots, and then later it is reorganized into this yellow body. Now, what we are going to see is that this yellow body represents a temporary endocrine structure, and therefore we are going to have a lot of lipid droplets in there. You are going to have a lot of smooth endoplasmic reticulum. You are going to have, of course, tubular cristae in the mitochondria, numerous mitochondria that you're going to find here, telling you that is going to perform a lot of production of some hormones. Now at this stage, okay, till the beginning of till the beginning of another menstrual cycle, we are going to call this phase luteal phase. Now this ovulation happened under the influence of luteinizing hormone. Therefore the development of this corpus luteum is also under the influence of luteinizing hormone. After all, it's called corpus luteum, so luteinizing hormone is going to help form this temporary endocrine structure. Now granulosa cells, okay, of the remaining follicle is actually converted to become what we call granulosa lutein cells. So these granulosa lutein cells will make a lot of what we call progesterone, which is going to actually help to actually further thickening the wall of the uterus, the endometrium. But it's also going to make some small amount of what we call estradiol or estrogen. Now this corpus luteum will persist, okay, this folded corpus luteum. So it means that this corpus luteum, yes, because it's going to be an endocrine structure, it will be invaginated. Okay, there will be a lot of blood vessels actually surrounding it, so that product will diffuse into those surrounding blood vessels to get into systemic circulation. Okay, now this corpus luteum will persist for about 2 weeks, and therefore we call this corpus luteum of menstruation. Okay, now what will happen is that, yes, after 2 weeks, if there is no fertilization of the ovulated oocyte, okay, this one, then what will happen is that this corpus luteum will regress, okay, to become a white body, and that white body is known as corpus albicans. Corpus still has to do with body, and albicans has to do with white. You become white body, which is useless, and it's not going to perform any endocrine function again. But in case fertilization should occur, then the trophoblast cells will actually secrete some kind of hormone, which we call it human chorionic gonadotropin. And this hormone is actually seen in the blood, which can also find it in urine, okay, around usually we find it in urine around 2 weeks of conception. Okay, so the trophoblast cells will secrete human chorionic gonadotropin to help maintain this corpus luteum until the placenta is functional enough to take over the hormone production. Now this is the placenta is enough so that they can actually placental vessels can actually supply blood to actually developing embryo and of course fetus. But prior to that, the nourishment will be coming from the endometrial glands, the tortoise glands, which we've seen already, will be coming from it, the glycogen rich secretions from it. Okay, Now, if that one persists, after pregnancy, then we call the corpus luteum of pregnancy. So the corpus luteum of pregnancy will be seen after 2 weeks after ovulation. So if you are still seeing it, then pregnancy is in there. Okay, there's pregnancy. Now, let me explain something. Now, you see, let me just digress more to explain something. Now, these are what we call the ovarian, vessels, the ovarian artery and ovarian vein. Now, if you go through what we call the tubectomy, oophorectomy, if you want to remove the ovary, then what happens is that care must be taken. You have to ligate these ovarian vessels, especially the ovarian artery, so that you don't actually go through it, cut through it, to cause a lot of bleeding, in there. So that is one thing that we have to, appreciate over here. So as we've seen already, we said that under the influence of follicle stimulating hormone, which is coming from actually the anterior pituitary gland, okay, stimulates the primordial follicles to go through follicular growth, so to become primary unilaminar, primary multilaminar, to the secondary or the antral or the vesicular follicle, which will have pockets of fluid, then eventually to the Graafian follicle, the mature follicle, which will, of course, go through that kind of ovulation. Just immediately after ovulation, what will happen is that, yes, I told you that there will be blood in there. Okay, that blood will get clotted to become what we call corpus hemorrhagicum. So corpus hemorrhagicum, you are going to find that just before you find what you call the developing corpus luteum. So as I told you, as follicular growth takes place, granulosa cells together with the thicker internal cells will be making what we call estradiol, and this estrogen or estradiol will help in initial thickening, okay, increase in blood vessels and all that of the endometrium. So you can see the glance, the tallness of the endometrium be increasing, okay, the height will be increasing as you move on. So this phase, okay, just after menstruation, is known as the proliferative state. That's the repair state. So after menstruation, which we've seen just last 3 to 5 days, or even can go to about 7 days, that is the menses. Then beneath, after that, these ones will be making those hormones, estrogens, as you can see, increasing the totality of those glands, and that one is known as the proliferative stage. And then just before ovulation, there's the LH stage, luteinizing hormone stage, increase in luteinizing hormone, okay, from the anterior pituitary, and that one will further because corpus luteum will be formed, then that's the secretory phase or the luteal phase, or the post-ovulatory phase, or the progestational phase, because progesterone will be produced maximally by what you call the granulosa lutein cells of the corpus luteum, okay, with small amount of estrogen also being produced as well. So that is actually what we are going to find with the ovarian cycle. So the ovarian cycle, we are going to have what we call the pre-ovulatory phase, or the proliferative state, or the estrogenic phase, okay, then, or we can also call it the follicular phase, because follicles are growing. Then you can have the ovulation, which will occur around mid-cycle, if it's a 28-day cycle, okay, around day 14. And that is why we say that around this area is the fertile area if you want to conceive. So around about 3 days to the left, and then 3 days to your right, okay, then around this area becomes your fertile period. But of course, you have to know the signs of ovulation, increase in body temperature. Sometimes some females may even experience what we call premenstrual sign, so that they may feel some slight pain around the pelvic area, or they may see some spots of blood just prior to ovulation. So if you target that, then you can have sex around that area, because of course I told you that after ovulation the oocyte will persist, will become viable to fertilization generally within 24 hours. So beyond 24 hours you may have sexual intercourse and it may be fruitless. So that is one thing that you have to know. You have to actually know when ovulation is going to take place. You can actually calculate it and then find average and then work around it, know the symptoms or the signs that you experience prior to ovulation. All right. One other thing that I want to tell you regarding the lymphatic drainage of the ovary will be through what we call the para-aortic lymph nodes. Again, para-aortic lymph nodes are going to help in that regard. So I hope you find this tutorial very helpful. But one other thing too that I want to say is that some females may go through what we call an ovulatory cycle. So they will still menstruate, but they will go through what we call the anovulatory cycle. Such that, yes, because there will be follicular growth, granulosa cells will be producing some estrogen, and therefore there will be some kind of thickening of the uterus, which will not be coming from the corpus luteum, progesterone from actually the thicker lutein cells, granulosa lutein cells of the corpus luteum will not be coming from that side. Therefore, the small thickening that took place will actually be shed off. So if you see such a thing, then you have to see your medical doctor to actually understand all these things. Now, for you to test that we are not actually ovulating, then you have to check your progesterone level after usually 28-day cycle, the mid luteal phase. So around the mid luteal phase, if you go to the hospital, you take your serum, and then we check actually your progesterone level. We want to see that your progesterone level should go beyond 30 nanogram per ml. So if it's less than 30 nanogram per ml, then it tells us that yes, you are not actually ovulating. You are not ovulating. So that is one thing that you have to know. So that's the mid luteal progesterone tests, or the 21 day if you are going to go through the 28-day cycle. That's one thing. Now the other thing that I want to actually tell you is menarche. Of course, menarche is the first menstrual period that a female is going to experience. The word is menarche. Of course, some people will say men should bring their keys to come and unlock the female. All right, so menarche, the first menses that a female is going to experience. Then the last menopause, which is the cessation of menstruation. Men should pause. Menstruation should pause, or men should pause actually. Then we can have a situation where we have what we call polycystic ovarian syndrome. Okay, polycystic ovarian syndrome, where you have a lot of cysts, fluid filled pockets forming within the the ovary. Okay, a lot of them actually around the edges. Now usually it could have genetic bearing, or it could be environmental actually. When you have such a phenomenon, then it results in what we call irregular menses. Okay, there will be irregular menses actually. Yes, even some people will tend to put on weight. It is actually also implicated in diabetes mellitus. It's also implicated in there if you are having polycystic ovarian syndrome. Then one other thing too is that it also leads to what we call hirsutism. Growth of hair, a lot of hair in the female, around the be a growth of beard, hair around the chin area. Okay, the mental area. You are going to see all those things, a lot of growth of hair in between the breasts. Yes, all these ones could be sign of it, but of course it has to actually be investigated to check if it is actually polycystic ovarian syndrome. Now one other thing too that I want to say is that sometimes there will be growth of endometrial cells. Okay, for instance, the womb cells which are supposed to be in the womb may actually grow inside the ovary, and that is what we call endometriosis of the ovary. Endometriosis of the ovary. Yes, even mainly that is what we are going to see. But remember that menopause comes with a lot of complications, or some side effects. Talking a lot, having flashes and all that. Having all those kind of being talkative. All these ones will be those kind of disorders which will be related to the ovary. So ladies and gentlemen, I hope you are going to find this helpful. Please remember the blood vessels, the blood supply. We're talking about the gonadal vessels, usually at the level of L2, L1, L2 of the abdomen. Actually supply the ovaries, drained by the ovarian veins, which are not going to be symmetrical. We've seen all these ones. All right, so have a good day.